"All rise." The bailiff's voice thundered through the courtroom. The crowd murmured as Judge Harold Grimshaw, a stout man with a thick mustache and a face always set in a scowl, took his seat. The air was thick with tension, but no one expected what was about to happen. A teenager, no older than 19, stood before the court in a cheap suit, a size too big for him. His name was Ethan Carter, and he had come to fight a case that seemed impossible to win. Judge Grimshaw leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he squinted at Ethan. A smirk tugged at his lips. "And who are you supposed to be, young man?" Ethan straightened his tie, his voice calm. "Ethan Carter, Your Honor, attorney for the defense." A wave of laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even the opposing lawyer, a sharp-dressed man named Victor Langley, shook his head in amusement. Judge Grimshaw chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, this is rich. This has to be some kind of joke." He turned to the courtroom. "Who let this child in here pretending to be a lawyer? Bailiff, escort him out before he embarrasses himself further." The courtroom doors swung open as the bailiff stepped forward, ready to drag Ethan out. But then, "Wait!" a voice boomed across the room. It was Mr. Hamilton, the accused man who sat at the defense table. His eyes were wide, filled with desperation and hope. "This young man is my attorney. He has the credentials to be here." Judge Grimshaw scoffed. "Ridiculous. A child cannot be an attorney." Ethan reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. With measured steps, he approached the judge's bench and placed it down in front of him. "This is my license to practice law," Ethan said, his voice unwavering. Judge Grimshaw's smirk faded. He grabbed the paper, eyes scanning it quickly. Then his face turned pale. His fingers trembled as he read the official stamp at the bottom. The courtroom fell silent. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a mistake. Ethan Carter was, in fact, a real lawyer. The laughter in the room had vanished. The bailiff, who had been ready to escort Ethan out, stood frozen. Even Victor Langley, who had been grinning moments ago, now had his mouth slightly open in shock. Judge Grimshaw cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority. This must be some kind of trick." Ethan met his gaze fearlessly. "No trick, Your Honor. I am a licensed attorney, and I'm here to defend my client." The judge's fingers curled around the paper, and his eyes darted toward Ethan as if seeing him for the first time. His voice came out as a whisper, but the weight of it crushed through the room. "This is impossible." The story truly begins long before Ethan stood in that courtroom, before he shocked an entire room full of people. It started months ago, when no one believed in him, when the world laughed at his dreams. Ethan Carter was no ordinary teenager. While kids his age spent their time on video games and social media, he buried himself in books, law books, to be precise. His mind was sharp, his memory impeccable, and his thirst for justice unquenchable. It all started on a stormy evening. Ethan had just returned home from school when he found his mother in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she clutched an envelope. "What's wrong, Mom?" he asked, setting his bag down. Tears welled in her eyes. "It's Mr. Hamilton. He's been arrested." Ethan's stomach twisted. Mr. Hamilton was their neighbor, an elderly man who had always been kind to them. He had helped Ethan with his studies, given him advice, and treated him like family. "But why?" Ethan asked, taking the letter from her hands. His eyes darted across the words. "Charged with fraud? That's impossible. He would never." "He says he's innocent," his mother said, her voice shaky. "But no one believes him. And we can't afford a lawyer." Ethan's mind raced. Mr. Hamilton had no family, no one to fight for him. The system was going to swallow him whole unless someone stood up for him. That night, Ethan made a decision. He would become Mr. Hamilton's lawyer. His mother thought it was an impossible dream. Even his teachers scoffed when he told them. "You can't just wake up one day and become a lawyer," they said. But Ethan didn't listen. He locked himself in his room, studying day and night. He read legal textbooks, watched courtroom trials, and memorized cases. He barely slept. He barely ate. His friends stopped calling, and his teachers thought he was losing his mind. But then something incredible happened. Ethan discovered something called an accelerated law program. A program meant for gifted individuals who could pass the bar exam at an early age. He applied, expecting nothing. And then, one day, a letter arrived. "Congratulations," it read. "You have been accepted into the program." Ethan dove deeper into his studies, pushing himself harder than ever. Months passed and then he did the impossible. He passed the bar exam. At 19 years old, Ethan Carter became a licensed attorney. Now, standing in that courtroom, facing a judge who had mocked him, staring down an entire room of people who doubted him, he finally had the chance to prove himself. And he wasn't going to waste it. Judge Grimshaw cleared his throat and set the paper down. "Well, Mr. Carter," he said, the mocking tone gone from his voice. "It looks like you are, indeed, a real lawyer, but that doesn't mean you can win this case." Ethan smirked. "We'll see about that, Your Honor." The trial had begun. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Grimshaw sat upright now, his face no longer holding amusement, but something closer to irritation. The courtroom, which had been laughing at Ethan just moments ago, was completely silent. Victor Langley, the opposing attorney, smirked and adjusted his tie. "All right, kid," he said, his voice smooth and arrogant. "Since you're so eager to embarrass yourself, let's begin." Ethan ignored him. He turned toward Mr. Hamilton, who sat nervously at the defense table. Ethan gave him a firm nod. "Don't worry, sir," he whispered. "We've got this." Judge Grimshaw banged his gavel. "Prosecution, proceed with your opening statement." Victor Langley walked confidently to the jury, his dark suit perfectly pressed. He paced in front of them with slow, calculated steps. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice rich and commanding. "Today, you will see undeniable proof that Mr. Hamilton committed fraud. He stole money from hardworking citizens, leaving them in financial ruin. The evidence against him is overwhelming." He turned sharply and pointed a finger at Mr. Hamilton. "This man," he continued, "was trusted by his community. And what did he do with that trust? He used it to steal." Victor walked back to his table, adjusting his sleeves. "By the time this trial is over," he said with a smirk, "there will be no doubt in your mind that he is guilty." He took his seat, satisfied with his performance. Judge Grimshaw turned his gaze to Ethan. "Mr. Carter, your opening statement?" Ethan took a deep breath. He stood up, buttoned his oversized suit jacket, and walked to the jury. Unlike Victor, he didn't pace. He stood tall, his eyes scanning their faces. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "you've just heard the prosecution tell you that my client is a criminal. That he stole money. That he abused trust." He paused, letting his words settle. "But what if I told you that none of that is true?" Some of the jurors raised their eyebrows. "What if I told you that Mr. Hamilton was set up?" Ethan continued. "That the real criminals are still out there, laughing while an innocent man sits here fighting for his freedom?" Victor Langley scoffed. "Objection, Your Honor. Baseless accusations." Ethan turned. "Not baseless, Your Honor. I have evidence to prove it." The courtroom murmured at Ethan's confidence. Judge Grimshaw narrowed his eyes. "I certainly hope so, Mr. Carter. Continue." Ethan nodded and turned back to the jury. "By the end of this trial, I will show you the truth. And when I do, there will be no doubt in your minds that Mr. Hamilton is innocent." He walked back to his table and sat down, his heart pounding. He had delivered his opening statement. Now, the real battle began. Judge Grimshaw adjusted his glasses. "The prosecution may call its first witness." Victor stood up. "The state calls Mr. Richard Wells to the stand." A well-dressed man in his late 40s walked confidently to the witness stand. He was a businessman with neatly combed hair and a watch that looked more expensive than Ethan's entire house. He took his oath and sat down. Victor approached him with a charming smile. "Mr. Wells, can you tell us what you do for a living?" "I'm a financial advisor," the man said smoothly. "I help people invest their money wisely." Victor nodded. "And how do you know the defendant, Mr. Hamilton?" "I invested in his business," Mr. Wells said. "He promised me, and many others, high returns on our investments, but instead of making us money, he stole it." Ethan frowned. That was a lie. Mr. Hamilton had never stolen a cent. Victor walked to his table and picked up a stack of papers. "Your Honor, I have here financial records showing that large sums of money were deposited into Mr. Hamilton's personal account. Money that was supposed to go to his investors." He handed the papers to Judge Grimshaw, who flipped through them with a frown. Victor turned back to the jury. This is proof that Mr. Hamilton took money that wasn't his. There is no other explanation. Ethan clenched his fists. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He shot up from his seat. Your Honor, may I cross-examine the witness? Judge Grimshaw eyed him carefully, then sighed. Proceed. Ethan walked to the witness stand, stopping just a few feet away from Mr. Wells. He tilted his head slightly. Mr. Wells, you said my client stole your money. Is that correct? Yes. And you're absolutely sure about that? Yes. Ethan nodded and took a slow step forward. Tell me, Mr. Wells, do you recognize this document? He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sheet of paper. He held it up for the courtroom to see. Mr. Wells squinted at it. I don't know what that is. Ethan's lips curled into a knowing smile. This is a record of your bank transactions from 3 months ago. He walked to the judge's bench and handed it to Judge Grimshaw. Your Honor, this document shows that Mr. Wells deposited a large sum of money, exactly the amount he claims was stolen, into an offshore account. A ripple of shock moved through the courtroom. Victor Langley's confident smirk faltered. Objection, he barked. Where did this document come from? Ethan turned. From public records, Mr. Langley. Anyone can access them if they know where to look. He faced Mr. Wells again. Would you like to explain why you claimed this money was stolen when you actually moved it yourself? Mr. Wells' face paled. I. Objection. Victor shouted again, his voice sharper this time. This proves nothing. My client was simply transferring his own funds. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Is that so? He turned back to Mr. Wells. Then tell us, sir, why did you report the money stolen after you had already moved it? The room was dead silent. Mr. Wells' lips pressed into a thin line. His hands fidgeted on the stand. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Ethan took a step closer. His voice was calm, but powerful. You lied to this court, didn't you? Mr. Wells looked like he wanted to disappear. Judge Grimshaw leaned forward. Mr. Wells, answer the question. I didn't mean to. Ethan cut him off. No further questions, Your Honor. He turned and walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of the moment. Judge Grimshaw rubbed his temples. Mr. Wells, you are dismissed. However, you may be facing perjury charges for misleading this court. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Victor Langley clenched his jaw. His star witness had just crumbled, and everyone knew it. Judge Grimshaw sighed heavily. Court will take a recess. We will continue in an hour. He banged his gavel, and the courtroom erupted into chaos. Ethan sat down, exhaling deeply. Mr. Hamilton turned to him, eyes wide. That was amazing. Ethan gave a small smile. We're just getting started. But just as he was about to relax, Victor Langley leaned in, his eyes sharp. You're a good kid, he muttered. But you have no idea what you just started. And with that, he walked away. Ethan watched him go, a chill creeping down his spine. Something told him that Victor Langley wasn't going to play fair. Ethan sat at the defense table, his mind racing. He had landed the first blow, but something about Victor Langley's warning stuck with him. You have no idea what you just started. What did he mean? As the courtroom emptied for recess, Ethan noticed Victor making a call. His expression was cold, calculating. He wasn't shaken at all by what had just happened. If anything, he looked amused. Mr. Hamilton leaned in. You were brilliant back there, he whispered. I don't know how you found that document, but you saved me. Ethan gave a small smile. We're not done yet, sir. That was just the first witness. Before Mr. Hamilton could respond, a tap on Ethan's shoulder made him jump. He turned to see a woman in a sleek black suit. She had sharp features, piercing green eyes, and an air of authority. I need to speak with you, she said, her voice firm. Ethan frowned. And you are? She handed him a card. Detective Rebecca Hayes, Fraud Division. I need to talk to you outside. Now. Ethan glanced at Mr. Hamilton before nodding. He followed Detective Hayes through the courthouse hall, his mind already spinning with possibilities. Was she here to help? Or was this another trick? Once they reached a quiet corner, Detective Hayes turned to him. You're in serious danger, kid. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Danger? She nodded. That was smart what you pulled in there with Wells, But you need to understand, Victor Langley isn't just some prosecutor. He's got connections. Powerful ones. People who don't like losing. Ethan folded his arms. And why are you telling me this? She hesitated, then sighed. Because I've been investigating this case for months, and I know Hamilton is innocent. But I don't have enough to take down the real culprits yet. Ethan's eyes widened. So you believe me? Yes, she said firmly. But that doesn't mean Langley will let you win. Ethan frowned. He can't cheat in open court. Detective Hayes let out a bitter laugh. You think powerful people play by the rules. Langley will do whatever it takes to bury this case. That means coming after you. Ethan swallowed. I have reason to believe that Wells isn't the only false witness, she continued. Langley has more people lined up to lie under oath. Ethan clenched his fists. That's illegal. Of course it is, Hayes said, but proving it is another matter. Ethan took a deep breath. Then I'll just have to beat him anyway. The detective studied him for a moment. You're not like other kids, are you? No, Ethan said simply. Hayes nodded. All right. If you're serious about this, I'll help. But watch your back. Langley isn't just playing to win. He's playing to destroy you. Before Ethan could respond, a loud noise made them both jump. A crash. Shouting echoed down the hall. Ethan turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. And then he heard it. Someone screaming his name. It all happened so fast. Ethan sprinted back toward the courtroom. People were gathered near the entrance, whispering. He pushed through the crowd. And froze. Mr. Hamilton was slumped against the wall, his face pale. His hands clutched his stomach, and blood was seeping through his shirt. Someone had stabbed him. Ethan's breath caught. Somebody help, he shouted. Detective Hayes was already pulling out her phone. We need an ambulance now. Mr. Hamilton gasped for breath, his eyes locking onto Ethan. You can't let them win, he wheezed. Save your strength, sir, Ethan said, panic creeping into his voice. The bailiff pushed through the crowd, shouting for order. The judge stormed out of his chambers, his face twisted in confusion. What is going on here? Ethan turned, his eyes scanning the hallway. Whoever did this, they were gone. Victor Langley stood at a distance, arms crossed, a cold smirk playing on his lips. Ethan's blood boiled. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was war. The hospital waiting room was silent except for the steady beeping of machines in the distance. Ethan sat in one of the hard plastic chairs, his fingers gripping the edge of his seat. His mind was racing. Mr. Hamilton had been stabbed. Someone had tried to kill him, and Ethan had no doubt who was behind it. Detective Hayes stood by the window, arms crossed, her jaw tight with frustration. The security footage was wiped, she said. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan's stomach twisted. He turned to her. It was Langley. Hayes sighed. I don't have proof. And without proof, we can't accuse him. Ethan clenched his fists. Then we'll get proof. Before Hayes could respond, the doctor walked in. Ethan shot to his feet. How is he? He asked, his voice urgent. The doctor pulled down his mask. He's stable. The wound wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but he lost a lot of blood. He needs rest. Ethan exhaled in relief. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated, then nodded. Only for a few minutes. Ethan rushed into the hospital room. Mr. Hamilton was pale, hooked up to an IV, but his eyes were open. He gave a weak smile. I guess I'm not dead yet. Ethan pulled up a chair. Who did this? Mr. Hamilton swallowed. I don't know. I was walking back into the courtroom. Someone grabbed me from behind. I didn't see their face. Ethan's jaw tightened. It was Langley's people. Mr. Hamilton sighed. You need to be careful, son. They're not just after me. They'll come for you next. Ethan sat back, his mind racing. He had underestimated Langley. This wasn't just about winning in court. Langley wanted to send a message. And Ethan got it loud and clear. He wasn't safe. None of them were. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the courthouse, his shoulders squared. The moment he walked in, all eyes were on him. The news of the attack had spread. Victor Langley stood near his table, straightening his tie. He turned, locking eyes with Ethan. And then, he smiled. It was infuriating. The smugness, the arrogance. Ethan gritted his teeth. You think this is a game? Langley shrugged. I think you're out of your league, kid. Ethan took a step closer. We'll see. Langley's smirk widened. We will. Before Ethan could respond, Judge Grimshaw entered the room. All rise. The trial was about to continue. But Ethan knew one thing for sure. Langley had just made a mistake. Because now, Ethan wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for revenge. Ethan sat at the defense table, his heart pounding in his chest. The trial was back in session, but things were different now. Someone had tried to kill Mr. Hamilton. This wasn't just about proving innocence anymore. This was about survival. Judge Grimshaw rubbed his temples. Before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the incident that occurred yesterday. His gaze flicked to Ethan for a moment before turning to Victor Langley. The court will not tolerate threats, intimidation, or violence in any form. Langley smiled, smooth as ever. Of course, Your Honor. We all want a fair trial. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. Langley was good, too good. He had just tried to have a witness killed, and yet here he was, acting like nothing happened. Judge Grimshaw sighed. Now, let's continue. Prosecution, call your next witness. Langley stood, adjusting his cuffs. The state calls Maggie Roth to the stand. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in a modest gray dress, walked up to the witness stand. She had kind eyes and a nervous expression. Ethan's stomach dropped. He knew who she was. Maggie Roth was Mr. Hamilton's former secretary. She had worked for him for years. If Langley had turned her into a witness, it meant one thing. She was about to lie. Langley approached her with a charming smile. Miss Roth, please tell the court how you know the defendant. Maggie swallowed hard. I was Mr. Hamilton's secretary for nearly 10 years. Langley nodded. And in those 10 years, did you ever witness anything suspicious? Maggie hesitated. Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. She didn't want to do this. Langley's smile didn't waver. Miss Roth. Maggie took a deep breath. Yes, she said quietly. Ethan's heart sank. Langley turned to the jury. Please, tell us what you saw. Maggie wrung her hands together. There were times when Mr. Hamilton would take money from the investment accounts. He said he would pay it back, but he never did. The courtroom murmured. Ethan shot up from his chair. Objection. Judge Grimshaw frowned. On what grounds, Mr. Carter? Ethan took a deep breath. He had to be smart. Your Honor, he said, walking toward the stand, Miss Roth worked for Mr. Hamilton for 10 years. And yet, this is the first time she's ever mentioned any wrongdoing? Maggie looked down at her lap. Langley spoke up. She was scared, Mr. Carter. Not everyone is as brave as you. Ethan turned to Maggie. Miss Roth, did anyone ask you to testify today? Maggie swallowed. Mr. Langley came to my house last week. The courtroom went silent. Ethan took another step. And what did he say? Langley's smile tightened. Objection? Relevance? Ethan shook his head. It's extremely relevant if the prosecution pressured a witness into testifying. Judge Grimshaw rubbed his chin. I'll allow it. Answer the question, Miss Roth. Maggie's hands trembled. He told me that if I didn't testify against Mr. Hamilton, they would investigate me. A loud gasp spread through the courtroom. Langley's face darkened. Ethan's heart pounded. He had just exposed Langley's tactics. Judge Grimshaw's frown deepened. Miss Roth, are you saying you were threatened into testifying? Maggie looked at Langley, then at Ethan. And then she nodded. Yes. Chaos erupted in the courtroom. Langley's expression turned to ice. Ethan turned back to Judge Grimshaw. Your Honor, I move to have Miss Roth's testimony struck from the record. Grimshaw nodded. Agreed. The jury will disregard Miss Roth's statement. Langley sat down, his jaw tight. He had just lost another witness. Ethan exhaled. He had won this round. But as he returned to his seat, Langley leaned in. You think you're clever, don't you? He whispered. Ethan didn't respond. Langley smirked. You just made a very big mistake. And then he sat back, completely calm. Ethan felt a chill down his spine. Something was coming. Something bad. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go horribly wrong. Langley had been exposed, twice. First, when Ethan proved that Richard Wells had lied about his missing money, and now when Maggie Roth admitted she had been threatened into testifying. Any other prosecutor would be panicking, but Langley? He was too calm. Judge Grimshaw banged his gavel. "We will resume with the next witness. Prosecution, do you have another?" Langley stood, smoothing out his suit. "Actually, Your Honor, I would like to request a short recess." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Judge Grimshaw sighed. "Fine. Court will resume in 1 hour." The moment the judge left, Langley turned and walked straight out of the courtroom. Ethan's stomach twisted. Something was happening, and he had to find out what. Ethan followed Langley out of the courtroom, careful to stay unnoticed. He watched as Langley stepped into a hallway and pulled out his phone. Ethan ducked behind a pillar, straining to listen. "We need to move now," Langley hissed. "The kid is getting too close." Ethan's breath caught. He was the target now. Langley continued, his voice low. "Yes, the package is ready. Make sure it gets to the judge before the trial resumes." Ethan's heart pounded. The judge? What was Langley planning? Before he could hear more, Langley turned. Ethan barely had time to move before Langley stalked past him, heading toward the exit. Ethan's mind raced. He had to warn Judge Grimshaw. He sprinted back into the courtroom and ran straight to Detective Hayes, who was leaning against the back wall, sipping a cup of coffee. "Langley is up to something," Ethan whispered. Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You're going to have to be more specific, kid." Ethan glanced around before lowering his voice. He was on the phone just now. He said something about a package for the judge. Hayes' expression turned serious. "You sure?" Ethan nodded. "We need to stop it before." Before he could finish, the courtroom doors burst open. A court officer walked in, carrying a large envelope. "Urgent document for Judge Grimshaw," he announced. Ethan's blood ran cold. This was it. "Wait," Ethan shouted, running forward. The officer paused. "Excuse me." Ethan pointed at the envelope. "That package. Who gave it to you?" The officer frowned. "It was delivered outside by a courier." Ethan turned to Detective Hayes. "We need to check what's inside." Hayes didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and took the envelope. The officer started to protest, but she flashed her badge. "Official police business." She carefully peeled open the flap and pulled out the contents. Inside was a stack of documents, and on top, a letter with the official court seal. Hayes unfolded it and read aloud. "Effective immediately, Judge Harold Grimshaw is recusing himself from the case due to conflicts of interest." Ethan's stomach dropped. No, he braved. Judge Grimshaw, the only person keeping this trial fair, was being removed. Langley had just played his trump card. Ethan turned to Hayes. "This is fake. It has to be." Hayes scanned the document. If it is, it's a very convincing fake. Just then, the doors to the judge's chambers opened, and Judge Grimshaw himself stepped out. He looked pale, shaken. "Your Honor." Ethan rushed forward. "This letter, this isn't real, right?" Grimshaw hesitated. He took the letter from Hayes and read it. His jaw tightened. "I received the same notice this morning," he said quietly. Ethan's breath caught. "You can't step down." "Langley, he's behind this." Grimshaw let out a heavy sigh. "I believe you." Ethan froze. "Then why?" Grimshaw lowered his voice. "I received a warning." He glanced at Hayes. "A threat." Ethan's fists clenched. Langley had done it again. He wasn't just winning in the courtroom. He was playing dirty behind the scenes. And now? Ethan had to face a new judge. A judge Langley had chosen. Ethan stood frozen, his mind spinning. Langley had done it. Judge Grimshaw was stepping down, and now a new judge, one likely handpicked by Langley, would take over the trial. Detective Hayes clenched her jaw. "We have to stop this." Judge Grimshaw shook his head. "I have no choice. If I stay on this case, something worse will happen." Ethan's stomach twisted. What did they threaten you with? Grimshaw didn't answer, but the tired, haunted look in his eyes said enough. Langley had him cornered. Before Ethan could argue further, the courtroom doors opened again. A court clerk stepped inside, clearing her throat. "All rise." Ethan turned, his heart pounding as a new figure walked into the room. Judge Samuel Prescott. Ethan's breath hitched. He knew that name. Prescott had a reputation. He wasn't just tough, he was ruthless. And he had a long history of siding with prosecutors. Langley's lips curled into a small smile as Prescott took his seat. Ethan swallowed hard. The real fight had just begun. "Mr. Carter," Judge Prescott said, flipping through the case file. "A 16-year-old attorney. This is a first for me." Ethan squared his shoulders. "Yes, Your Honor." Prescott raised an eyebrow. "And you believe you can handle this case?" Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor." Prescott studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "Very well, let's proceed." Langley stood. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my next witness, Officer Dan Riley." Ethan tensed as a uniformed police officer walked up to the stand. Officer Riley had been one of the officers who arrested Mr. Hamilton. Ethan gritted his teeth. Langley had lost 2 witnesses already, so now he was bringing in the police. Langley approached the stand with his usual confidence. "Officer Riley, can you confirm that you were part of the investigation into Mr. Hamilton's alleged fraud?" Riley nodded. "Yes, sir." Langley smiled. "And when you searched his home, did you find anything incriminating?" Officer Riley nodded again. "Yes, sir. We found several bank statements showing money transfers to offshore accounts." Ethan's stomach dropped. Langley turned to the jury. "So, to be clear, official police evidence proves that Mr. Hamilton did move money illegally?" "Yes." Langley clapped his hands together. "No further questions, Your Honor." Ethan took a deep breath. This was bad. He stood, walking toward the witness stand. "Officer Riley, you say you found these bank statements in Mr. Hamilton's home." "That's correct." Ethan folded his arms. "Where exactly did you find them?" Officer Riley hesitated. "In his study." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Was the study locked?" Riley frowned. "No." Ethan took a slow step forward. "So anyone could have planted those papers?" Langley shot up. "Objection, speculation." Judge Prescott nodded. "Sustained." "Mr. Carter, unless you have evidence, move on." Ethan bit his lip. He needed proof. Then suddenly, an idea hit him. He turned back to Riley. "Officer, when did you find these documents?" Riley blinked. "During our search of his home." Ethan nodded. "Right, but when exactly?" "What day?" Riley flipped through his report. "March 12th. Ethan's pulse quickened. "Are you sure?" Riley frowned. "Yes." Ethan turned to Judge Prescott. "Your Honor, I request permission to present new evidence." Prescott sighed. "This better be good, Mr. Carter." Ethan hurried to his briefcase, pulling out a document. "This is Mr. Hamilton's travel record. On March 12th, he was out of the country." The courtroom gasped. Langley's face darkened. Ethan turned back to Officer Riley. "So tell me, officer, how could Mr. Hamilton have placed those papers in his own study if he wasn't even in the country?" Riley's face paled. I don't know." Ethan pressed forward. "Did you check for fingerprints?" Riley hesitated. "No." Ethan turned to the jury. "The only piece of evidence against my client was found in an unlocked room while he was out of the country, and they didn't even check for fingerprints." Langley shot up. "Objection. He's twisting the facts." Judge Prescott banged his gavel. Overruled. Langley's jaw tightened. Ethan smirked. He had just destroyed another witness. Judge Prescott leaned back. "Officer Riley, you're dismissed." As Riley left, Ethan turned to Mr. Hamilton. The older man gave him a small, hopeful smile. But Ethan knew better. This wasn't over. He had won another round. But Langley wasn't finished yet. And Ethan had the sinking feeling that the next move would be the deadliest yet. Ethan knew Langley wasn't going to let that loss slide. He had just dismantled yet another one of Langley's witnesses, exposing the planted evidence and proving Mr. Hamilton couldn't have placed the bank statements himself. But instead of looking defeated, Langley was smiling. And that terrified Ethan more than anything. Judge Prescott sighed. "Mr. Langley, do you have any credible witnesses left?" Langley straightened his tie. "I do, Your Honor. But first, I have a special request." Ethan's stomach clenched. "Here it comes." Langley turned to him, smirking. Your Honor, the prosecution requests that Mr. Carter step down as the defense attorney. The entire courtroom erupted. Ethan shot to his feet. Objection, that's ridiculous. Judge Prescott's eyebrows lifted. Mr. Langley, you had better have a very good reason for this request. Langley gave a fake look of concern. I do, Your Honor. Mr. Carter is a minor, and now that the case has become increasingly dangerous, I question whether he is mentally capable of continuing. Ethan's fists clenched. Langley wasn't attacking the evidence this time. He was attacking Ethan himself. Judge Prescott tapped his fingers on his desk. You raise an interesting point, Mr. Langley. Ethan's heart dropped. No, he couldn't let this happen. He had to fight back. Ethan quickly stepped forward. Your Honor, I was approved by the Bar Association. If my age was a problem, I wouldn't be here in the first place. Langley didn't miss a beat. Yet since this trial began, there have been multiple incidents. A witness nearly died. Your own client was stabbed. These things don't happen in normal trials, Your Honor. Maybe the boy is in over his head. Ethan gritted his teeth. This isn't about me. This is about the truth. Langley smiled. And what happens when this boy genius gets someone else hurt? Judge Prescott went silent for a long time. Then he exhaled. Mr. Carter, I must admit, this case has not been normal. I can't ignore the risks. Ethan's pulse pounded. No, he said firmly. I won't step down. If this trial is dangerous, it's because Langley is making it dangerous. Langley scoffed. Oh, so now I'm some kind of villain? Ethan locked eyes with him. You tell me. The room was silent. Judge Prescott drummed his fingers on his desk. Then, finally, I will allow Mr. Carter to remain. A rush of relief hit Ethan. But then, Prescott continued, however, given the dangers present in this case, I am ordering an investigation into Mr. Carter's credentials. If any irregularities are found, he will be removed immediately. Ethan's relief shattered. Langley's smirk widened. That was his plan all along. He wasn't trying to remove Ethan right now, he was setting a trap. And if they found anything, even the smallest flaw in Ethan's past, he was done. Ethan sat alone in the courthouse hallway, his mind racing. Langley was coming for him. Not in the courtroom. Not through legal arguments. But through his past. He had to be perfect. Absolutely perfect. If there was anything, even a small mistake, Langley would use it to destroy him. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Ethan looked up. Detective Hayes. She sat beside him, folding her arms. You okay, kid? Ethan exhaled. Not really. She nodded. I heard about the investigation. Ethan shook his head. They won't find anything. I passed the bar legally. I studied harder than anyone. Hayes frowned. You sure about that? Ethan hesitated. And that was the moment he realized. There was something. Something he had buried deep, never thinking it would come back. A secret. A mistake. And if Langley found out, everything would fall apart. Ethan's hands trembled as he sat alone in the courthouse hallway. There was something from his past, something small, something he thought no one would ever care about. But Langley would care. Langley would dig through every detail of Ethan's life until he found it. Detective Hayes studied him carefully. What is it, Carter? What aren't you telling me? Ethan hesitated. Could he trust her? Yes. He had no choice. He took a deep breath. When I applied for the bar exam, I wasn't legally old enough to sit for it. Hayes blinked. What? Ethan ran a hand through his hair. I had all the knowledge. I was ready, but the system wouldn't let me take the exam because of my age. So what did you do? Ethan swallowed hard. I used a different birth date on the application. Hayes let out a long breath. You lied to the Bar Association. Ethan clenched his fists. It wasn't about cheating. I knew I could pass. I just needed the chance. Hayes rubbed her temples. Kid, if Langley finds that out, he'll use it to get me disbarred, Ethan finished. Hayes stood up. We need to act now. If we wait, Langley's investigators will find this before we can stop it. Ethan's mind was spinning. What do we do? Hayes pulled out her phone. There's only one option. You have to get ahead of it. If you admit this yourself before Langley reveals it, you might have a chance. Ethan's stomach twisted. But if I tell the judge, he could remove me from the case immediately. Hayes nodded. Yeah, but if Langley tells him first, you'll be removed and your legal career will be over before it even starts. Ethan clenched his jaw. He had fought so hard to get here. If he came forward now, it could cost him everything. But if he didn't, Langley would end him. There was no choice. He'd had to confess. The courtroom was packed when Ethan walked back in. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. Judge Prescott raised an eyebrow as he approached the bench. Mr. Carter, do you have something to say? Ethan took a deep breath. Yes, Your Honor. I have a disclosure to make. Langley's smug expression faltered slightly. He wasn't expecting this. Ethan turned to the judge. Before we continue this trial, I need to come forward about something in my past. Something that could affect my ability to serve as Mr. Hamilton's attorney. The courtroom went silent. Judge Prescott narrowed his eyes. Go on. Ethan swallowed. When I applied for the bar exam, I wasn't technically eligible to take it yet. The age requirement. He hesitated, then forced himself to continue. I altered my birth date on the application. Gasps filled the room. Judge Prescott's expression darkened. Are you admitting that you falsified your application? Yes, Ethan said firmly. I knew I could pass. I did pass. I didn't do it to cheat. I did it because I wasn't willing to wait years to prove myself. Prescott drummed his fingers on the bench. Mr. Carter, do you understand how serious this is? Ethan nodded. I do. Langley finally stood up, his smirk returning. Well, Your Honor, I think this speaks for itself. Clearly, Mr. Carter cannot be trusted to. Judge Prescott held up a hand. Sit down, Mr. Langley. Langley's smirk faded. Prescott turned back to Ethan. Mr. Carter, you did something unethical. Very unethical. However, you came forward before it was exposed. Ethan held his breath. Prescott exhaled. I will allow you to continue this case. Ethan's heart nearly stopped. Langley's head snapped up. What? Your Honor. Prescott banged his gavel. Enough. Mr. Carter's ethics will be reviewed by the proper authorities after this trial. But in this courtroom, he is still the defense attorney. Langley's fists clenched. Ethan turned to Hayes, who gave him a small nod. They had beaten Langley to his own game. But just as Ethan allowed himself to breathe, Langley spoke again. Well, he said, standing. Since we're all confessing things today, I suppose it's time for my final witness. Ethan stiffened. Langley's smirk returned, sharper than ever. The prosecution calls Detective Rebecca Hayes to the stand. Ethan's stomach dropped. Hayes went rigid beside him. Langley turned to her, his eyes glinting. Detective, why don't you tell the court what you've been hiding from your young friend here? The courtroom exploded. Ethan's blood ran cold. Langley had just made his most dangerous move yet. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Langley had just called Detective Hayes, the one person who had been helping him, to the witness stand. Something was wrong. Hayes stood still, her face unreadable. But Ethan saw it, a flicker of hesitation, of fear. Langley was smirking again. He had planned this. Judge Prescott sighed. Detective Hayes, take the stand. Hayes walked slowly to the witness box, her jaw tight. She sat down, took her oath, and folded her hands in front of her. Langley strolled toward her, his confidence dripping from every step. Detective Hayes, he said, his voice silky smooth, how long have you known Mr. Carter? Hayes didn't blink. A few weeks. Langley nodded. And in that time, have you been providing legal assistance to him? Ethan clenched his fists. Where is he going with this? Hayes exhaled. I have been providing information relevant to his case, yes? Langley smiled. That's very interesting. Because according to these records, he held up a thick folder. You've been meddling in this case for far longer than a few weeks. Hayes' jaw tightened. Langley flipped through the pages. Oh, look at this. Financial reports. Internal police notes. Even private conversations from your fellow officers. He looked up. Detective Hayes, did you illegally access police records to assist Mr. Carter? Ethan's stomach dropped. Hayes didn't answer. Judge Prescott leaned forward. Detective, answer the question. Hayes looked at Ethan. Her eyes were calm, almost resigned. Then she turned back to the judge. Yes, she said. The courtroom erupted. Ethan felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. Hayes had been helping him, but she had broken the law to do it. Langley's smirk widened. Served to summarize, this entire defense was built on illegally obtained information. Ethan shot up. Objection. She was helping uncover the truth. Langley turned to him, feigning disappointment. Oh, I love your passion, Carter. I really do. But the law doesn't care about feelings. It cares about rules. And your friend here broke every single one. Judge Prescott banged his gavel. Enough. He turned to Hayes. Detective, I'm placing you under investigation for misconduct. I suggest you get a lawyer. Hayes gave a small nod. She knew this was coming. Ethan felt sick. Langley had baited him. He let Ethan win small battles, only to burn everything at the last moment. Langley turned back to Judge Prescott. Given that the entire defense has been compromised, I moved for an immediate mistrial. Ethan's blood ran cold. A mistrial? That meant everything he had fought for, everything Mr. Hamilton had endured, would mean nothing. Judge Prescott frowned. I'll need a moment to consider. Your Honor. Ethan stepped forward, his voice stronger than he felt. This case isn't about legal loopholes. It's about truth. Mr. Hamilton is innocent. Langley has lied to this court. He has used fake witnesses, planted false evidence, and now he's trying to bury the truth under technicalities. The courtroom murmured. Langley's smirk faltered slightly. Ethan turned to the jury. You know the prosecution's case is falling apart. You've seen it. They've lost witness after witness. And now they want to erase everything because they know they're losing. He turned to Judge Prescott. Don't let them win this way. Prescott was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled. Mistrial request denied. Ethan's knees almost buckled from relief. Langley was furious. Prescott banged his gavel. This trial will continue. However, Detective Hayes' testimony will be struck from the record. Ethan's stomach clenched. He had won, but at a cost. Hayes was in trouble. Langley sat down, his expression dark. He had almost pulled it off. But the case wasn't over yet. The next day, the courtroom was electric. Langley was down to his last witness. And if Ethan could take this one apart, it would be over. Langley stood. The prosecution calls Jonathan Pierce. Ethan tensed. Pierce was the bank manager who had handled Mr. Hamilton's accounts. If he was lying, it would be hard to prove. A tall man in a dark suit walked to the stand, took the oath, and sat down. Langley approached. Mr. Pierce, can you confirm that Mr. Hamilton personally authorized the money transfers? Pierce nodded. Yes, I witnessed it myself. Langley turned to the jury. There you have it. A direct witness. Mr. Hamilton did commit fraud. Ethan stood. Cross-examination, Your Honor. Judge Prescott nodded. Proceed. Ethan approached the stand. He studied Pierce. Calm. Too calm. Mr. Pierce, Ethan began, do banks keep video footage of transactions? Pierce hesitated. Yes. Ethan nodded. And where is the footage of Mr. Hamilton making these transfers? Pierce swallowed. It was erased. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Erased? Langley stood. The footage was erased due to routine data clearing. Nothing unusual. Ethan ignored him. He turned back to Pierce. You work in finance, right? Pierce nodded. Ethan smiled. Then you must know, every money transfer leaves a digital signature. Pierce stiffened. Ethan turned to Judge Prescott. Your Honor, I'd like to submit new evidence. Prescott nodded. Go ahead. Ethan pulled out a printed document. This, he said, is an audit report of the transfers in question. He walked over and placed it on the judge's bench. Prescott scanned it. Then his eyes widened. Ethan turned back to Pierce. Can you explain why the real digital signature on the transactions isn't Mr. Hamilton's? The courtroom exploded. Langley jumped to his feet. Objection. Where did this come from? Ethan smiled. Public records, Mr. Langley. Your people didn't delete everything. Pierce's face drained of color. I don't know anything about that. Ethan stepped closer. Really? Because this proves that someone else authorized those transfers. He leaned in. And I bet we all know who. The jury was staring at P.S. now. He was sweating. Judge Prescott banged his gavel. Mr. P.S., I suggest you answer. P.S. looked at Langley. Langley's face was stern. P.S.'s lips trembled. Then, I was told to do it, he whispered. Langley went rigid. Prescott leaned forward. Told by who? P.S. swallowed hard. Then, in a barely audible voice, he said, Victor Langley. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Ethan exhaled. He had done it. He had won. Langley shut up. This is outrageous. Judge Prescott slammed his gavel. Enough. Mr. Langley, you are now under investigation for legal misconduct and fraud. Langley's face twisted in fury. Ethan turned to Mr. Hamilton. The older man was crying. The case was over. Justice had won.